Welcome to another episode of our video series of the mechanics of human cognition. You know, it's so easy to think of burnout as just being really tired. We've all been there, that feeling of just complete exhaustion after a long week. But what if it's not about an empty battery? What if it's something way more fundamental, like a full-on fuel crisis happening deep inside our minds? And that's exactly the idea we're going to explore today. We have to reframe how we think about burnout, get past this simple idea that it's just a lack of energy. Instead, think of it as a critical failure in our mental drive system. This isn't something a good night's sleep can fix. It's about missing a very specific kind of psychological fuel. And this right here is the key. Burnout is an active state. It's not you slowly fading out. It's the moment your mind, after being pushed way too hard for way too long with no real reward, basically just goes on strike. It's a cognitive resignation. It's your brain sending up a giant flare saying, hey, this path we're on, it's completely unsustainable. This analogy just paints the perfect picture, doesn't it? That horse isn't being lazy or weak. It's being forced to run full speed towards nothing, a horizon that never gets any closer. When there's no destination, no purpose, no chance to rest and feel a sense of accomplishment, the system is basically designed to fail. The collapse isn't just possible, it's inevitable. It's what happens after all that purposeless motion. Okay, so let's get into the actual mechanics of what's happening inside our brain's architecture. It really boils down to the relationship between two really important parts that control both our drive and our ability to manage that drive. So think of your brain's operating system kind of like this. Your emotional brain, the limbic system, that's the engine. It is incredibly powerful. It runs on impulse, instinct, raw emotion. It's what gives you the go. But then you have the frontal cortex. That's the driver. The driver holds the steering wheel, makes the rational calls, plans ahead, and tries to control that big, powerful engine. Well, burnout is what happens when the driver completely runs out of fuel and loses all ability to steer. The engine just sputters out or goes haywire. And what's so fascinating here is the kind of fuel we're talking about. For the complex thinking work most of us do, a paycheck just isn't enough to keep the driver engaged. Your frontal cortex, your executive function, it runs on a much higher grade fuel. It needs psychological and social rewards, real recognition for your hard work, praise when you do a good job, and maybe most important of all, a clear sense of purpose. Without these things, its ability to manage that powerful engine just starts to fall apart. So when we're running low on this high-grade mental fuel, what do? Our minds instinctively start looking for the easiest, quickest substitute they can find. And in the world we live in today, that almost always means we turn to our screens. It's a question we really have to ask ourselves, right? You can spend an hour, maybe more, just scrolling through feeds, thinking you're relaxing, or looking for a little bit of fun. But then you put the phone down. Why is it that the main feeling isn't refreshment, but regret? The answer is all about the quality of the reward our brain is getting. Digital feeds, they're engineered to give us what we call lower order pleasures. They're quick, cheap, little hits of dopamine. It's basically the neurological equivalent of trying to live on a diet of candy. But what our minds are actually starving for are higher order pleasures, the stuff you get from deep conversations, creating something, or achieving a tough goal. Those activities release a much richer mix of neurochemicals, like serotonin and anandamide, sometimes called the bliss molecule, that actually give you lasting fulfillment and refuel the system for real. Now let's look at how this whole thing becomes a trap. Social media platforms are absolute masters of this loop. They are not designed for your happiness, they're designed to capture your attention. The expectation of finding something cool, combined with the powerful uncertainty of not knowing when it will appear, that's a perfect recipe for a dopamine trigger that keeps you hooked. It keeps you scrolling for hours, chasing these tiny, unsatisfying little rewards, and it leaves you feeling more drained than when you started. So how do we spot this fuel crisis before the whole system just completely seizes up? Well, there are some really clear warning signs that your cognitive engine is running on fumes and getting dangerously close to a breakdown. It is so important to pay attention to these. Anhedonia is a huge red flag. That's when the hobbies, the people, the things that used to recharge you just don't bring you any joy anymore. Cynicism is another big one. It's like your mind's defense mechanism, trying to devalue the whole system it feels trapped inside. And that really strong urge to stay up late, binging shows or scrolling online, that's a classic sign of a brain that was starved for meaningful rewards all day, and now it's desperately trying to make up for it with any cheap pleasure it can find. Okay, so recognizing the problem is step one, but what's the actual solution? I'll tell you what it's not. It's not about just gritting your teeth and pushing harder. True recovery, the kind that lasts, means you have to fundamentally shift your entire motivational system. You have to change where your energy comes from in the first place.
This metaphor is just perfect for figuring out the way forward. Let's break it down. Action without awareness. Just being busy for the sake of being busy, that's like a long string of zeros. It has no real value. But on the other hand, awareness without action, knowing you're burnt out but not doing anything about it, that's like the number one. It has potential, but by itself, it's not much. The magic happens when you put them together. When your awareness, your one, is placed in front of your actions, the zeros, it gives them meaning and multiplies their value by a huge amount.
And this brings us right to the heart of the solution. You have to understand why you're doing what you're doing. If your motivation is to escape, to just stop feeling so burnt out, you're running away from a negative. And that's a weak, short-term kind of fuel that always runs out. The alternative is motivation by pursuit. That's when you choose a goal, a value, a version of yourself that you actively want to move toward. This is a powerful, sustainable, and truly regenerative source of energy because it creates its own momentum.
This is really the ultimate point. The solution isn't about forcing yourself to take a cold shower at 6 a.m. just for the sake of being disciplined. That's just motivation by escape. You're escaping the feeling of being lazy. But that exact same cold shower becomes an incredibly powerful tool if your why is to build the mental toughness you need for a goal you actually care about. The action itself is always less important than the purpose that's fueling it.
So as we wrap this up, let's make it real. You have the awareness now. You have your one. The only question left is, what meaningful action, what zero, are you going to put it in front of to multiply its value? What is the one thing you can do, starting today, to begin moving towards something positive and rewrite your own equation?